work for like 3 days for me?
Yeah.
You guys, if you need to like make up work or whatever like that, then you can do that. So all right. So what I want to do is I want to finish up the chapter here. We're continuing talking about Chinese history. This is the last slide from Tuesday, right? And so we were talking about essentially how like Chinese history. Well, again, China is one of the kind of the cultural hearths that we talked about, like with Mesopotamia and the Sumerians, the Egyptians, and then the Indus Valley and such. Obviously, 4 of the 5, with the exception being the early civilizations of Mesoamerica, like the Olmecs and the Mayans, develop around rivers. There's a question on the test: what river does early Chinese civilization, develop around? Yellow River, right? Where they refer to as Huanghe, China Sorrow. This is where we see the first kind of like Neolithic sites in China. We see the development and cultivation of rice and stuff like that. But generally, when we talk about history, right, they like to divide kind of Chinese history up into dynasties. And they give them names, the family names, right? And so the first dynasty, the Shang dynasty, is going to lay the foundation for a lot of kind of like dynasties that's come to succeed them. There's the first evidence of the written language of Chinese, which was written on those oracle bones. They're a feudal society. They're urban. They established some of the early cities, like the first capital city of Yin, or Anyang, as they refer to it now. They also developed 2 types of industries: bronze working and then silk. And so the other thing is, though, that not all these dynasties, they're not going to last forever, right? And so in Chinese history, there's a way to try to explain how power changes hands through something called the mandate of heaven, right? So the idea that power occurs in a cycle. Now, the Shang knew nothing of the mandate of heaven. This wasn't developed until the dynasty that succeeded, and the Zhou used it to kind of convince the population, who was now basically there's a new sheriff in town, so to speak. The Zhou is the longest ruling dynasty. Right? At one point, though, it splits into an eastern and western Zhou. They often refer to as the autumn and spring period in Chinese history. That was the period of kind of great like Chinese philosophers. Right? So particularly the 2, Confucius and Lao Tzu. Confucianism and Lao Tzu. What philosophy / religion does he establish? Taoism, right? And you guys did the comparative kind of article there. However, when both of the men had died, their philosophies, their religions weren't necessarily kind of entrenched into Chinese society. They had followers that kind of maintained a lot of their teachings and basically kind of compiled texts and such. This was the symbol we had talked about initially of Taoism, the yin and yang, which basically represented kind of balance in nature. So Confucianism also kind of uses this as well. And then what we see is that this period, right after the autumn spring period, called the Warring States period, where basically the Zhou officially lose the mandate of heaven. We have about 7 families at the end. They're all vying for the mandate of heaven. All right. So even when we're kind of talking about philosophy here, both Confucianism and Taoism initially kind of like at the end of the Warring States period, neither one of them win the argument of the day. All right, the philosophy that wins the argument of the day at the end of the Warring States period is a philosophy referred to as legalism. And those who kind of espouse this philosophy are referred to as legalists. Right? Now, whereas like Confucius is talking about how government should kind of like be like a kind of a caring parent to a certain extent, that concept of filial piety, legalists believe that basically you need to have a heavy hand to maintain order. This is another way to kind of try to kind of make sense out of a chaotic period like the Warring States period. So probably the most prominent kind of legalist during the early part of the Warring States period is a guy named Shang Yang. All right, there was another guy named Li Se. All right, Li Se is going to have the ear of a young prince of one of the families that's vying for the mandate of heaven, and that young prince is eventually going to win. All right, the Warring States period, and that's the start of what we call the Qin dynasty. Like I was telling you guys on Tuesday, there's a couple different ways how you spell these Chinese terms and names. Qin is the more pinyin way, right? The more kind of like phonetically Chinese way. The way Giles' way was Chin. So this is where we get the name China from, right? And so this is why they refer to this as the first dynasty to unify China. And essentially what it does is they wipe out the kind of feudal boundaries. They maintain some of these kind of feudal lords and stuff were able to kind of serve the Qin, but they served as almost like ministers, right? So this is the first time where we see a kind of a centralized power ruling. Where we talked about the Shang and the Zhou, there were still these kind of feudal states. They just happened to be the strongest of the feudal states at this time. All right. And so the video I kind of talked about the Qin dynasty. They're the shortest ruling dynasty. All right. And so many of their concepts and many of their kind of their government practices was based on legal principles. Li Se became a minister with basically advising the first Qin emperor. So again, the pattern when we see about like geography, each kind of dynasty geographically, China grows. All right, and so the first emperor of China, China, is a guy named, they refer to him as Qin Shuangdi. All right. Now, a lot of in Chinese, the last name, the family name tends to go first. Shuangdi is actually a title. All right. Well, you see the word D in there to signify kind of relationship to the gods. It means basically like higher than king. So in a Western translation, the only other kind of figure at this time that would be higher than the king would be an emperor. So that's why we classify him as the first emperor of China. All right. He is going to like wipe out the feudal boundaries, but also establish kind of a uniform kind of currency. All right, each of these states have their own kind of coins and currency here. Also, establishment of weights and measurements. The video talked about how like wheels on carts had to be the same size, right? Because it basically kind of created a kind of a road system there. And then he also establishes a building of kind of public works projects, anything that's kind of built by the state. Most famous one being the Great Wall of China. So usually men were conscripted, either drafted into military service or working on these public works projects, where they could be away from their families from years on end. What Qin was doing was essentially basically connecting these kind of early walls and ramparts in the purpose of keeping out like kind of barbarians to the north. The Chinese are kind of like the Romans in the sense that anybody who's not them tends to be labeled as a barbarian. But you had a lot of these horse nomadic cultures to the north, like the Huns, later the Mongols and stuff like that, Tartars and such, that were constantly kind of pushing on the exterior of China. All right, so the video I talked about, and there's my man Qin. This is the standard kind of crown that Qin kind of set the pattern for later dynasties to wear. I think the Great Wall and all, I don't know if the video says, about 13,000 miles. All right. It could be seen from space, but this wasn't all built during the Qin. There was later dynasties that kind of added on to it as well. All right. And then another thing the video talked about was these terracotta warriors. Qin apparently had a massive tomb, an elaborate tomb, where basically was recreating China. Like the rivers were made of mercury. On the ceiling, you had gemstones and stuff like that. Unfortunately, the people that were the artisans that were working in that were sealed in its walls, probably, so they wouldn't let anybody know where it was. In the 1970s, they discovered there's these guys that were kind of digging for a well, and they discovered what they call Pit 1. And these are all these terracotta. I think there's about 8,000 in all. But the military was probably, I think it said it was like 6 times the size of the Roman army, if I'm not mistaken. Each of these guys basically posed individually for their terracotta warrior. I think Miss Lindauer was there in 2000. She met the guy that was one of the guys that was digging the well. He was basically at a table. He would sign autographs. A friend of mine, like in I think it was like late 90s, went here and actually bought a replica of these terracotta warriors in the gift shop. Had it sent back, kind of like flown back to St. Louis, pretty expensive. But it was kind of cool. He used to have it in his living room, like right before you walk here, which is kind of neat. You walk in, wasn't too much taller than me, right? But when he got married, his wife kind of was creeped out by it. So he had to when he got married, he put it out in his backyard, in his garden. And he credited the fact that he was living in South St. Louis at the time. All the houses around him were broken into except his. And he claimed it was because his terracotta warrior had the top knot on there. I think he's got it like in his basement. I tried to see if he could let me have it, but it was pretty expensive. But again, this was like discovered not until like the 1970s. Also, the Qin had a capital city, like all these dynasties do. This city is the city of Xi'an, or Xianyang, at the time of the Qin dynasty. It was the site close to the site where the Shang capital Anyang was. Also, later dynasties, like the next dynasty is going to establish their capital here, but they're calling all the city Shangyang. All right. Again, Qin rule was particularly cruel. And at one point, Qin had there was 3 assassination attempts on his life. One assassination attempt, he actually basically disarmed the guy who was trying to assassinate him. So he was a little paranoid, and he was obsessed with trying to find an elixir that would basically kind of prolong his life. One of them probably killed him. When he died, his 2 ministers, Li Se, and Li Se was particularly cruel. In the video, they talked about how Li Se was kind of observing rats in the granary there. and noticed that the rats that were well-fed were a little bit more aggressive. He equated that to education. So under Li Si's orders, Confucian scholars were buried alive. All right. So and they basically they burned books. The only books that were allowed at the time of the Qin dynasty in China at the time were books on mathematics, books on engineering, and agriculture. Any books on history, any books on philosophy were banned. All right. And then when he dies, when Qin dies, Li Si and this eunuch, this guy was a minister, all right, and they would have these guys who were eunuchs that were basically, so they were allowed to around the concubines. A guy named, I think it was Weng Zhao, were able to basically hold off information that the king had died or the emperor had died. They put his son, Qin Shi on the throne, but then later they convinced him to commit suicide. They manipulated him, and they basically forged a letter stating that that Qin Shi told his son that he would bring dishonor to the family and that he should commit suicide. And they tried to take over. Li Si dies, and then there's basically a small civil war that breaks out. All right, so they're going to technically lose the mandate of heaven relatively, like we're talking around 210 or so. And then in 206, the next dynasty takes the mandate of heaven after a brief civil war, and that's the Han dynasty. The Han dynasty was started by my man Liu Bang, right? But Liu Bang went by the imperial name Gao Zu, mainly because of his peasant origins. He served within the military during the Qin dynasty. The kind of harsh legalist style of government was replaced with a little bit more liberal kind of style of government. This era is referred to as one of the golden ages in Chinese history, right? And so this today, like those who are ethnically Chinese would identify themselves as Han Chinese, right? And this kind of script that is written today is often referred to as Han. All right, so they kind of so the name China takes its name from the Qin dynasty. Those who kind of ethnically identify themselves as Chinese identify themselves as Han. So these two dynasties still have a lasting kind of thing to the language, if you will. All right, and so here's my man Liu Bang. Good looking dude. All right, and then the geography of China at the time here. This extends further west. We'll talk about that reason that, and down further south. So geographically, this is at zenith here. The Han kind of reached its pinnacle during the reign of the fifth emperor, a guy named Wu Ti. Wu Ti is known as the martial emperor for, like it says there, for driving the Huns back across the wall. He extended control into Vietnam, and still to this day, particularly in northern Vietnam, the largest kind of minority in Vietnam would be the Chinese. The Han lost a little bit of control in Vietnam at one point because there was these two widow women, and the Trung sisters are actually revolted against the Han. They established their own kind of independent state for a little bit of time. We were talking about them, I think, when we get to chapter 8. Wu Ti, for a long time, was the longest serving emperor. He served about 54 years. There was a later emperor during the Qing dynasty, the last dynasty in China that ruled for about 60 years. All right, so here's my man Wu, all right, wearing the same crown that kind of Qin Shi wore, dating back to there. So while Wu has legalists in his ministry, what he does, though, is he elevates Confucianism, right? And so while Confucianism doesn't become the state religion, it does become something that you need to know if you want to get a government job, what we call a civil service job. All right, and so generally the questions were based on the 5 classics, all right, and then something called the Analects, which were the kind of words of wisdom that kind of were associated with Confucius. Now, how does this would be a job if you were a tax collector or an engineer wanting to build a bridge or whatever. So to get a job within kind of like the Chinese government, you'd have to know Confucianism. So it would be like the equivalence, though, of, let's say, if you're like a welder and some questions on your exam were my stupid world history questions. You'd be like, how the hell does this relate to anything? The idea behind this is that if you're willing to immerse yourself into kind of Confucian teachings, you're somebody that is worth hiring. All right. And so also a lot of these civilizations, you don't find a lot of kind of social mobility. Here, though, education was the kind of great equalizer at times. So you would find like families, poor families, that would take one of their sons and they would basically put all their kind of eggs in one basket and they basically have that son study. right? And basically kind of give that son like exemptions from doing like kind of like farming and stuff like that. So if they passed that civil service gig and they got a chance to work with the government, that they could not only elevate their own kind of social status, but the family status as well. All right, so this is somewhat unique here in a lot of these ancient societies. You don't have a lot of social mobility. Here, education provides that. And that's still why Confucianism is still kind of relevant in kind of Chinese culture today. All right, so this, like, the Qin were basically killing varying kind of Confucian scholars alive. The Han are elevating the status of Confucianism. All right, and then also too, what we see here is that the Han kind of distinguished themselves from the Qin from globalization and trade. They became particularly wealthy thanks to something called the Great Silk Road, which is the the earliest examples of what we refer to as globalization. All right, so this was actually not one road, but a series of routes and roads. Like we had talked about the Royal Road in Persia. Part of that was used to the Great Silk Road. So this connected essentially commercially, connected China, because the origins of it is in the capital Xiangyang for the Han, all the way through the Middle East, and eventually goods made their way to Rome. If we didn't have COVID-19, what we would normally do the next time we would meet is I would divide the room up into two areas, and then kind of divide that into like 6 groups. And you would take a persona of a group that traded along the Silk Road, and I'd give you things like money, these little kind of cut out little coins and items to sell on the Silk Road, and you would get to hustle, right? And so like you kind of test your entrepreneurial skills, right? But thanks to COVID-19, I can't be giving you guys the Rona by exchanging things, so we can't do that, all right? So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to kind of just show you a little TED video that talks about the significance of the Silk Road, all right?
A banker in London sends the latest stock info to his colleagues in Hong Kong in less than a second. With a single click, a customer in New York orders electronics made in Beijing, transported across the ocean within days by cargo plane or container ship. The speed and volume at which goods and information move across the world today is unprecedented in history. But global exchange itself is older than we think, reaching back over 2,000 years along a 5,000-mile stretch known as the Silk Road. The Silk Road wasn't actually a single road, but a network of multiple routes that gradually emerged over centuries, connecting to various settlements and to each other, thread by thread. The first agricultural civilizations were isolated places in fertile river valleys, their travel impeded by surrounding geography and fear of the unknown. But as they grew, they found that the arid deserts and steppes on their borders were inhabited not by the demons of folklore, but nomadic tribes on horseback. The Scythians, who ranged from Hungary to Mongolia, had come in contact with the civilizations of Greece, Egypt, India, and China. These encounters were often less than peaceful. But even through raids and warfare, as well as trade and protection of traveling merchants in exchange for tariffs, the nomads began to spread goods, ideas, and technologies between cultures with no direct contact. One of the most important strands of this growing web was the Persian Royal Road, completed by Darius I in the 5th century BCE. Stretching nearly 2,000 miles from the Tigris River to the Aegean Sea, its regular relay points allowed goods and messages to travel in nearly 1/10 the time it would take a single traveler. With Alexander the Great's conquest of Persia and expansion into Central Asia through capturing cities like Samarkand and establishing new ones like Alexandria as Shat, the network of Greek, Egyptian, Persian, and Indian culture and trade extended farther east than ever before, laying the foundations for a bridge between China and the West. This was realized in the 2nd century BCE when an ambassador named Shang Qian, sent to negotiate with nomads in the West, returned to the Han Emperor with tales of sophisticated civilizations, prosperous trade, and exotic goods beyond the western borders. Ambassadors and merchants were sent towards Persia and India to trade silk and jade for horses and cotton, along with armies to secure their passage. Eastern and western routes gradually linked together into an integrated system spanning Eurasia, enabling cultural and commercial exchange farther than ever before. Chinese goods made their way to Rome, causing an outflow of gold that led to a ban on silk, while Roman glassware was highly prized in China. Military expeditions in Central Asia also saw encounters between Chinese and Roman soldiers, possibly even transmitting crossbow technology to the Western world. Demand for exotic and foreign goods and the profits they brought kept the strands of the Silk Road intact, even as the Roman Empire disintegrated and Chinese dynasties rose and fell. Even Mongolian hordes, known for pillage and plunder, actively protected the trade routes rather than disrupting them. But along with commodities, these routes also enabled the movement of traditions, innovations, ideologies, and languages. Originating in India, Buddhism migrated to China and Japan to become the dominant religion there. Islam spread from the Arabian Peninsula into South Asia, blending with native beliefs and leading to new faiths like Sikhism. And gunpowder made its way from China to the Middle East, forging the futures of the Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal empires. In a way, the Silk Road's success led to its own demise as new maritime technologies like the magnetic compass found their way to Europe, making long land routes obsolete. Meanwhile, the collapse of Mongol rule was followed by China's withdrawal from international trade. But even though the old routes and networks did not last, they had changed the world forever, and there was no going back. Europeans seeking new maritime routes to the riches they knew awaited in East Asia led to the age of exploration and expansion into Africa and the Americas. Today, global interconnectedness shapes our lives like never before. Canadian shoppers buy t-shirts made in Bangladesh. Japanese audiences watch British television shows, and Tunisians use American software to launch a revolution. The impact of globalization on culture and economy is indisputable, but whatever its benefits and drawbacks, it is far from a new phenomenon. And though the mountains, deserts, and oceans that once separated us are now circumvented through supersonic vehicles, cross-continental communication cables, and signals beamed through space rather than caravans traveling for months, none of it would have been possible without the pioneering cultures whose efforts created the Silk Road, history's first World Wide Web.
All right, so like I said, it's about 4,000 miles. Right, but I said there's other routes that kind of like the existing routes. Like there's one called the Spice Route that kind of dips down into India, if you will. But historians refer to it as the Silk Road because the probably most expensive commodity, particularly for those in the West, like Rome, was Chinese silk. Right, but this is the first example we refer to as globalization. And this also kind of meant the kind of exchange of ideas as well. On certain spots there, like this is supposed to be a Han watchtower in kind of Western China. The Han controlled certain kind of trade posts there. And what they did was kind of collecting tariffs. So what that does for the Han is it makes the government particularly wealthy, and they don't have to tax their citizens as much. However, as they start to lose some of these kind of like trade posts there, they kind of force a little bit more taxation on their citizens. That's going to lead to their downfall. Like I said, the exchange of ideas is also prominent along the Silk Road. It's because of the Silk Road that China is introduced to Buddhism during the time of the Han Dynasty. And eventually, Buddhism becomes the largest religion in the empire. Like I was telling you guys Tuesday, Buddhism would mix with Taoism fairly well. It even mixed with Confucianism. All right. We'll talk about something later when we talk about China again in chapter 8, where they have something called Neo-Confucianism, which takes certain ideas from Buddhism and try to kind of amend them with Confucian principles and such. For whatever reason, though, like Taoism and Confucianism don't really translate Western, kind of like trying to kind of travel along the West, and they tend to be more kind of an East Asian kind of concept and idea here. We had talked about in the time of the Guptas, there was a Chinese Buddhist monk by the name of Bai Shan, who later is going to use the Silk Road to travel to India during the time of the Guptas to get more kind of Buddhist texts and bring it back to China here, right? So like I said, the Silk Road is important for trade and commerce, but also for ideas, exchanging ideas and stuff. Right? However, all of these dynasties, like I said, kind of go through that period where they're going to lose the mandate of heaven. For the Han, it was kind of the beginning of the end was roughly around the 1st century AD. When we start to see the arrival, kind of like the emergence of what they call peasant societies, and these peasant revolts emerge. Some of them with kind of cool names, red eyebrows, green woodsmen. The big one, though, is the yellow turbans. These were actually, many of them were Taoists, where you would think of Taoism with peace and stuff like that. They kind of revolted against kind of Han rule, right? And they even kind of established their own little kind of independent dynasty towards the tail end of the Han period here. But eventually the Han are going to lose in the 2nd century AD. They're going to lose the mandate of heaven. And we're going to go through another kind of 300-year period of civil war. At that time, we start to see the emergence of a dynasty called the Sui that we'll talk about when we get into chapter 8. So that's chapter 3 in a nutshell, basically. I'm going to stop the recording here.